Hi everyone and welcome to this session. My name is Defa Ansokal and I'm going to take you through this introduction session. In this session, you're going to familiarize ourselves with the data that you're going to explore throughout our exercise. This exercise will be divided into 4 categories where we'll have the introduction bit that I'm doing today, data visualization, data analysis, and lastly, the data conclusion part of it. Throughout this session, our task will be to visualize CO2 emission data and tell a story about it. This work will explain how to predict CO2 emission for the cars sold in Canada during 2015. And this dataset captures the details of how CO2 emission by a vehicle can vary with different features. This dataset contains 13 variables. A detailed view of the variables shows that not all variables will be useful for this exercise, and I selected only the most relevant and gave up other variables. The analysis will be done on different variables, where our first variable is fuel type. And in fuel types, we have 3 categories, where Z presents premium gasoline, X presents regular gasoline, and D presents diesel. Analysis will also be done on make variable, which is the make of the car, fuel consumption of the car, and CO2 emission of the car. The assumption that we'll make throughout this study is that the study does not take into account the different methods that can be used to decrease this level of emission, like particle filters or the catalytic converters. The questions that we seek to answer at the end of this exercise are: is there a relationship between the type of fuel a car uses and the amount of CO2 emitted? Another question is, what are the most influencing features that affect CO2 emission the most? And lastly, will there be any difference in the CO2 emission when fuel consumption for city and highway are considered separately and when their weighted variation interaction is considered? And lastly, we're going to look at the hypothesis that we'll be testing during this study, where our first hypothesis is this relationship between the type of fuel a car uses and the amount of CO2 emitted. Its alternative is there's no relationship between the type of fuel a car uses and the amount of CO2 emitted. Another hypothesis is there's difference in the CO2 emission when fuel consumption for city and highway are considered separately, and its alternative is there's no difference in CO2 emission when fuel consumption for city and highway are considered separately. This marks the end of the introduction bit of this data, and in the next session we'll be doing data visualization, where we'll get to visualize our CO2 emission data in Canada. And don't forget that you obtained our data from Kaggle datasets. And until then, keep it here, where we'll be having more fun in doing the data visualization. And don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for listening, and bye.